The house was too quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet that lets you hear your own thoughts, but a heavy, still quiet, like the air inside a sealed box. It was a quiet that came from having too much space and not enough life to fill it. Sunlight streamed through tall, arched windows, cutting long, bright rectangles across the marble floors. In those rectangles, dust motes danced, the only things in the whole hallway that seemed to be moving with any freedom. The air itself felt thick, smelling of lemon polish and old wood. A scent that was supposed to mean clean but just felt like the smell of time standing still at the center of it all. In a room so large it was called the ballroom, though no one had danced in it for years, sat the piano. It was a grand piano, black and gleaming, so polished you could see your face in it if you dared to get close enough. It wasn't just an instrument, it was a statement. It said, "We are so wealthy that we can buy a masterpiece and let it sit here, just to be looked at." It was angled perfectly towards the tall windows, as if waiting for an audience that never arrived. Its lid was propped open just a little, like a sleepy eye, and the white and black keys stared out, untouched and perfect. For the family who owned it, the piano was a piece of furniture. As important as the crystal chandelier or the portrait of a grim-faced ancestor hanging over the fireplace, it was part of the backdrop of their lives. Upstairs, in a room that was bigger than most people's entire apartments, Isabel was waking up. She didn't hear an alarm clock. A soft knock on her door announced the maid, who would pull back the heavy curtains and lay out her clothes for the day. Isabel lay in her bed, the silk sheets cool against her skin, and stared at the ceiling. Another day? It would unfold just like the one before, and the one before that. There would be a breakfast she barely tasted, walk in the gardens that were beautiful but felt like a painted picture, and hours of stretching time that she had to fill with nothing. Her life was a beautifully wrapped gift box, but inside, there was nothing. She had everything a girl could want, closets full of dresses, shelves of books she'd never read, and all the free time in the world. But the free time was the problem. It was a vast, empty desert she had to cross every single day. She felt like a ghost in her own home, floating through the rooms, her feet barely touching the ground. Sometimes she would trace the patterns on the expensive wallpaper with her finger, wondering if this was all there was. Downstairs, the house was coming to life with quiet efficiency. Ilara was one of the servants who made this quiet life possible. She moved through the hallways with a soft tread, her arms full of clean linens. She was new to the house, having only been there for a few months, and she still felt like an outsider. To the family, she was just a pair of hands, a uniform, a face in the background. But Ilara saw everything. She saw the way the master of the house would sigh into his newspaper at the breakfast table, a sound of deep boredom. She saw the way the mistress would rearrange flowers that were already perfect, her hands restless. And she saw the way the young Miss Isabel drift from room to room like a lost balloon. Ilara's own world was small and physical. It was the feel of a rough scrub brush against a stone floor, the weight of a silver tray, the smell of soap on her hands after a long day of washing. Her hands were her tools, and they were strong and capable. But when she was alone, when she was polishing the silver or dusting the furniture, she would sometimes catch herself moving them in a different way. Her fingers would dance across the polished surface of a table, tracing invisible patterns. They would tap a silent, frantic rhythm on the wood of a chair. It was a habit, a ghost of a life she used to have. One morning, her duties took her into the ballroom. She had to dust the furniture, a task that felt both ridiculous and sacred. The room was so big, her footsteps echoed softly, no matter how quietly she tried to walk. And there it was, the piano. It stood there, black and magnificent, holding the silence of the room. Ilara stopped. Her heart gave a little thump against her ribs, a familiar, painful beat. She had been avoiding this room and this object for weeks, because the piano was not just a piece of furniture to her. It was a memory. It was a dream. Her father had been a musician. He didn't play in grand concert halls, but in small, smoky pubs where people clapped and sang along. He had taught her to play on their old second-hand upright piano, a piano with yellowed keys and a sticky pedal. He had told her she had a gift, that her fingers could find stories in the music that no one else could. Music had been their language, their connection. But then he was gone, and the piano was sold to pay for things, and the music stopped. Alara's world became about survival, not about beauty. The graceful, dancing part of her hands had been locked away, placed by the hard, calloused worker. She walked slowly towards the Steinway, her duster held loosely in her hand. She didn't dare touch it. She just looked. She imagined the feel of the cool, smooth keys under her fingers. She could almost hear the sound it would make, a rich, full sound that would fill this empty, silent house. A deep longing washed over her, so strong it almost brought her to her knees. It was a physical ache, a hunger for something she couldn't have. She saw her reflection in the glossy black surface, a small, tired-looking girl in a plain gray uniform. She looked away, a lump forming in her throat. She was just a servant. This piano was not for her. It was for people who could afford to let it be silent. From the top of the grand staircase, Isabel watched. She had been wandering, as she often did, and had stopped when she saw the new girl, the quiet one, enter the ballroom. She expected her to just dust and leave. But the girl didn't. She stopped and just stared at the piano. Isabel couldn't see her face clearly, but she could see her posture. There was something about the way she stood, so still, so focused. It wasn't the look of someone admiring an expensive object. It was something else. It was the look of someone seeing a long-lost friend. Isabel saw the girl's hand, the one not holding the duster, clench into a fist at her side, then slowly relax. She saw her shoulders rise and fall with a deep, quiet breath. Isabel felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time: curiosity. In her world, everything was known. Everything was in its place. People acted as they were supposed to. Servants worked, and the family existed. But this girl, this quiet servant, was breaking the rules. She was feeling something powerful in a room that was supposed to be for nothing but display. Isabel didn't understand what she was seeing, but she knew it was important. For the first time in a long time, she had a question in her mind that she wanted an answer to. Who was this girl, and what did the piano mean to her? She stayed on the stairs, hidden in the shadows, and watched as the girl finally turned away, her shoulders slumped, and continued with her dusting. The moment gone, as if it had never happened. But Isabel knew it had, and the silence in the house felt a little different now. It wasn't just empty, it was full of a secret. The days leading up to the annual summer gala were the only time the house ever felt truly alive. It was not a gentle awakening, but a violent, noisy one. The quiet that usually lay thick on the furniture was shoved aside by the shouts of men setting up tents on the lawn and the clatter of extra catering, equipment being brought in through the service entrance. The air, once smelling only of lemon polish and old wood, was now a confusing mix of fresh-cut flowers, paint fumes from a last-minute touch-up on the ballroom trim, and the sharp, clean scent of floor wax. The mistress of the house, a woman whose smile was as perfectly practiced as her posture, moved through the chaos like a general inspecting her troops, her voice a tight, clipped string of commands. For Isabel, it was like watching a play she knew by heart, but one she hated. Her room became a staging area. Dresses in pastel colors, each more expensive and uncomfortable than the last, were laid out on her bed. Shoes she would only wear once sat in their boxes like precious, painful jewels. She was supposed to feel excited. This was the highlight of her family's social calendar, the night they proved to everyone else just how important they were. But all she felt was a sense of dread, a heavy stone in her stomach. She would stand before her full-length mirror, practicing the smile she was supposed to wear. It was a gentle curve of the lips, a soft look in the eyes. But when she looked at her own reflection, she saw that the smile never reached them. Her eyes were always distant, watching a door no one else could see. Downstairs, the world of the staff had multiplied. Temporary workers, faces Isabel had never seen and would never see again, moved with a hurried, impersonal efficiency. In the middle of it all was Alara. She was no longer just a housemaid. She was a cog in a vast, rumbling machine. Her job for the evening was simple: be invisible. She was to circulate through the party with a tray of empty glasses, collecting them as soon as they were emptied. It was a task that required her to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time, to see everything without ever being seen. As she helped the other staff prepare, polishing silver until it shone like a star, she felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. The gala meant the house would be full of people, but it would also be full of eyes. And she had learned early on that the best way to survive was to make sure none of those eyes ever landed on her for too long. The night of the gala arrived. The sun bled into the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and the house began to glow. Light spilled from every window, and the sound of a string quartet drifted out onto the manicured lawns. One by one, expensive cars crunched up the gravel driveway, depositing men in stiff collars and women in shimmering gowns at the front door. Isabel stood at the top of the grand staircase, her mother beside her, a perfect picture of a wealthy, happy family. She smiled until her cheeks ached, nodding and greeting guests as they were announced. She felt like a doll on display, her dress a cage of silk and lace. Ilara watched from the shadows of the hallway, her tray of glasses held steady. She saw the way the guests kissed the air next to each other's cheeks, the way their laughter was a little too loud. She listened to their conversations, which were all about money or other people's money. It was a world that felt completely alien to her. A world where the biggest problem seemed to be deciding which villa to visit for the holidays. She moved through the crowd like a whisper, her gray uniform a dull spot in a sea of bright colors. No one looked at her. She was just part of the scenery, like the potted ferns or the marble statues. And then she saw it. The piano. It sat in its place of honor in the ballroom, looking more magnificent than ever. Its black surface reflected the glittering chandeliers above, and the white keys seemed to glow with their own light. But it was being treated like a table. People rested their champagne flutes on it. A woman had left her silk shawl draped over the stool. Each time Ilara saw it, a small, sharp pain pricked at her heart. It was like seeing a proud, wild bird trapped in a gilded cage. With people tapping on the glass and laughing, Isabel, for her part, was barely listening to the man talking to her. Someone important who owned a lot of ships. She was scanning the room, her eyes searching. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but then she saw her. Ilara, moving silently along the edge of the ballroom, her face a mask of calm concentration. Isabel watched her, a strange feeling pulling at her. She remembered the way the girl had looked at the piano that day, a look of such intense longing that it had stuck with her. Now, surrounded by all this noise and fake cheer, Ilara seemed like the only real person in the room. The party was in full swing. The string quartet played a lively tune, but it was just background noise, soundtrack to the chatter and the clinking of glasses. Then, a man with a booming voice and a bright red tie, a guest Isabel's father was trying to impress, gestured towards the piano. "My good man," he said, slapping Mr. Ashworth on the back. "You have a masterpiece right there. A Steinway. It's a crime to let it sit there silent all night. Someone ought to play it." A hush fell over the small group around him. Mr. Ashworth's smile tightened. He chuckled, a low, uncomfortable sound. "Ah, well, you know how it is. It's more for decoration, really. A conversation piece." "Nonsense," the man in the red tie declared, his voice carrying across the room. "An instrument is meant to be played. Who here can give us a tune?" He looked around, his eyes sweeping over the guests. People suddenly found their drinks incredibly interesting. They stared at their shoes or at the paintings on the wall. No one wanted to be put on the spot. No one wanted to risk embarrassing themselves in front of all these important people. The silence that followed was awkward and heavy. Ilara was standing just a few feet away. Having just collected a pair of empty glasses from a small table near the piano, the man's words hit her like a physical blow. It's a crime to let it sit there silent. For her, it was the truest thing that had been said all night. In that moment, the noise of the party, the faces of the guests, the fear of being seen it, all faded away. A memory sharp and clear as a bell rose up in her mind. She was a little girl again, sitting on a worn wooden stool next to her father. Their small apartment was filled with the sound of his playing. sad, beautiful melody that seemed to tell the story of their lives. He had stopped playing and turned to her, his calloused finger pointing to a specific key. "This one, Alara," he had said. "This is the heart of the song. Everything else just dances around it." Her father's voice was so real in her head that she forgot where she was. She forgot she was a servant at a party. She forgot she was invisible. She set her tray down on a small, empty table, the movement slow and deliberate. Her hand, the one that scrubbed floors and washed dishes, rose into the air. It felt disconnected from her body, moving on its own. She took a step towards the piano. The world narrowed to a tunnel, and at the end of it was the single white key her father had shown her. The heart of the song, her gloved finger, a thin layer of black cotton separating her from the ivory, came down and pressed the key. The note that rang out was not loud, but it was perfect. It was a pure, clear middle C. And it cut through the stuffy air of the ballroom and the hum of 100 conversations like a shard of glass. It hung in the air, vibrating with a life and a sadness that seemed to come from another world. And then, as the note began to fade, a second thing happened. The room went quiet, the talking stopped, the laughing died. The string quartet stumbled to a halt. Every head turned. Every eye, including Isabel's, followed the sound back to its source. And there they saw her. Ilara, the servant girl, her hand still resting on the key, her body frozen. The spell was broken. The memory vanished, and in its place came a crashing wave of reality. She saw the faces, all of them, staring at her. She saw the shock, the confusion, the judgment. And then she saw Mr. Ashworth. His face, which had been wearing a tight, polite smile, was now a mask of pure, cold fury. His eyes were like two hard stones. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Ilara felt the blood drain from her face. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild, trapped thing. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. She had broken the most important rule of all. She had been seen, and in the sudden, terrifying silence, she knew she was ruined. The silence in the ballroom was a living thing. It had weight and texture, pressing down on everyone, making it hard to breathe. It was the silence of 100 people holding their breath at once. A silence so complete that the distant hum of a refrigerator in the kitchen sounded like a roar. In the center of this suffocating quiet stood Alara, a small, gray statue of a girl, her fingers still resting on the key that had shattered the evening. Her mind was a blank wall of terror. She could not think, could not feel anything but the cold dread that spread from her chest to the tips of her toes. She was a shipwreck. The angry faces in the crowd were the sharks circling in the water. Mr. Ashworth's face was the closest shark. The polite, strained smile he had worn all evening had been wiped away, replaced by a dark, dangerous purple that crept up his neck. His jaw was a hard line of stone. He took a step forward, and the movement seemed to break the spell for everyone else. A soft gasp rippled through the crowd. A woman in a deep blue gown clutched her pearls so tightly her knuckles turned white. They all knew what was coming. It would be loud, it would be humiliating, and it would be the end of the girl in the gray uniform. He was the master of this house, and this was a stain on his perfect evening that needed to be scrubbed out. Immediately and publicly he opened his mouth. The words were already forming, sharp and cruel on his tongue. "You," he began, his voice a low growl that promised destruction, but the word never finished. From the top of the grand staircase, a voice cut through the tension. It was not loud, but it was clear and steady, and it carried an authority that no one in the room, not even the master of the house, seemed to possess. That was a beautiful note. Every head, including Mr. Ashworth's, turned. There, standing on the landing, was Isabel. She was no longer the bored, ghostly girl who had drifted through her own life. In the shimmering light of the chandelier, she looked different. Her shoulders were back. Her chin was held high. She was not looking at her furious father or the scandalized guests. Her eyes were fixed on Alara, and in them there was no pity, only a calm, unwavering focus. Isabel had watched the whole scene unfold from her spot on the stairs. She had seen the note hang in the air, pure and perfect. She had seen the shock on the faces, the anger on her father's. But she had also seen something else in that moment before the silence was broken. She had seen the look on Alara's face as she played the note. It wasn't a look of mischief or mistake. It was a look of pure, unthinking expression, like a bird singing because it has a song in its heart. And in that look, Isabel had seen a reflection of her own hidden self. She saw a girl trapped in a life that didn't fit. A girl with a soul that needed to sing. The boredom that had been her constant companion for years had vanished, replaced by a hot, sharp feeling of protectiveness. For the first time, she wasn't just watching the story unfold. She was a part of it, and she knew with a certainty that scared and thrilled her that she could not let this moment be crushed. She began to descend the stairs. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and graceful. The silk of her dress whispered against the marble steps, the only sound in the room. The guests, caught between the fury of the host and the strange intervention of his daughter, could only stare. They parted for her as she reached the bottom of the stairs and walked across the ballroom floor, path opening up before her as if by magic. She walked past her father without a glance, past the smirking man in the red tie, past all the faces that represented the world she was supposed to belong to. She walked directly towards the piano, towards the terrified servant girl. She stopped a few feet away from Alara, who was now staring at her with wide, confused eyes, her fear momentarily replaced by utter bewilderment. Isabel looked at the girl, then at the piano, and then back at the girl. A small, genuine smile touched her lips. It was the first real smile she had worn all night, and it transformed her face. "I'd like to hear the rest of the song," Isabel said. The second silence that fell over the room was deeper and more profound than the first. This was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of complete and total disbelief. It was the sound of a social order being turned on its head. A servant had touched the piano, and now the daughter of the house was asking for an encore. It was an act of rebellion so quiet, so unexpected, that no one knew how to process it. Mr. Ashworth's face had gone from purple to a pale, mottled red. He looked at his daughter as if he had never seen her before. His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He wanted to roar, to drag her out of the room, to restore order, but he was frozen. To chastise his daughter now would be to create an even bigger scene, to air their dirty laundry in front of the very people he was trying to impress. He was trapped by his own need for appearances, and he knew it. His power had been neutralized, not by a shout, but by a simple, polite request. The guests were lost. They looked from the heiress to the servant, from the daughter to the father. The rules of their world were simple and clear, and Isabel had just torn them up and thrown them in the air. Whispers started again, but this time they were frantic and confused. "Did you hear what she said? What is she doing?" Her father looks apoplectic. The man in the red tie was no longer smirking. He was watching with an expression of intense, almost greedy curiosity. This was better than any music he had hoped to hear, and Alara stood there, her heart pounding a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. She looked from Isabel's calm, determined face to the hostile, bewildered crowd. She saw the fury in the master's eyes, the confusion on the faces of the guests. She knew she should run. She should apologize, beg for forgiveness, disappear before the storm broke. But she couldn't. She was held in place by the girl's eyes. There was no pity in them, no condescension. There was only a simple, powerful sincerity. Isabel wasn't trying to save her out of charity. She was asking because she genuinely wanted to hear the music. She had heard the truth in that one single note, and she wanted to hear more. For a moment, Alara felt a flicker of the same feeling she had had when she played the note, a feeling of forgetting who she was supposed to be. But the terror was still there, cold and sharp. Her hands felt clammy inside her gloves. Her legs felt like they might give out. She was just a servant girl. This was a grand piano in a room full of rich, important people. To play it now would be to step off a cliff without knowing if there was anything to catch her. She looked at Isabel, searching for any sign of a trick, any hint of a cruel joke. But there was nothing. Just a steady, patient gaze that seemed to say, "Asterisk, it's okay. I see you. Asterisk, the room held its breath, waiting. The fate of the servant girl, the reputation of the family, the unspoken rules of their entire society, all hung in the balance, waiting to see what a girl with calloused hands and a song in her heart would do next. The silence stretched, thin and fragile, like a thread pulled to its breaking point. It was a silence filled with 100 different questions, all aimed at the terrified girl standing by the piano. Elara felt the weight of every stare, a physical pressure that made it hard to stand up straight. Her mind was a battlefield, where the terror of her father's fury fought with the unbelievable, impossible look in the rich girl's eyes. The fear was a cold hand closing around her throat, telling her to run, to apologize, to disappear before she was shattered into 1,000 pieces. But the look in Isabel's eyes was a warm spark in the freezing dark of the ballroom. It wasn't pity. It was something far more dangerous. It was recognition. Elara looked from Isabel's calm face to the hostile crowd. She saw the master of the house, his face a contorted mask of rage and helplessness. She saw the guests, their expressions a mixture of shock, scorn, and morbid curiosity. They were waiting for a spectacle, for a punishment, for the world to be set right again. But in that moment, Elara realized something. The world had never been right for her. She had spent her life being invisible, being quiet, being nothing more than a pair of hands that cleaned and served. She had locked away the most important part of herself, the part her father had called a gift, and had buried it under layers of soap and floor wax. And for what? To stand in a room like this, afraid to breathe? The warm spark in Isabel's eyes grew into a tiny flame. It was a crazy, reckless thought, but it took root and spread through her veins like wildfire. What if, just for once, she wasn't invisible? What if she let the music out? The thought was terrifying, but it was also exhilarating. It was the feeling of standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing you could fall, but also knowing you could fly. Slowly, deliberately, Elara moved. Her first action was so small that almost no one noticed it. She pulled at the fingertips of her right glove, peeling the thin black cotton away. It was a strange, intimate gesture in the middle of the grand, silent room. Then she did the same with her left hand. She let the 2 limp pieces of uniform fall to the floor beside her, like 2 shed skins. Her hands were free. They were not the soft, smooth hands of the ladies in the room. They were a worker's hands with calluses on the palms and a small, faded scar on her right index finger from a kitchen knife, but they were her hands. They were the hands her father had held as he guided them over the keys of their old piano. She took a step forward and sat. For all nana why dada why molai and all sense some by a mono thala my bida wham to sell I can out that way I will I go by the top tawa was so set It was cool and smooth against her legs. She felt the vastness of the piano in front of her, its 88 keys, a universe of possibilities. For a moment, her courage faltered. The sheer scale of it, the weight of all those eyes, it was too much. Her fingers hovered over the keys, trembling. Then she looked up and found Isabel's gaze again. The girl hadn't moved. She was still watching, her expression unchanged. It was that steady, patient look that gave Elara the final push. She took a breath that shook her entire frame, let it out slowly, and then she began to play. The first few notes were hesitant, like a person testing the ice on a frozen lake. They were simple, a quiet melody that seemed to come from a long way away. It was a sad sound, a lonely sound. It was the sound of a small, cold room and the memory of a father's laughter. It was the sound of longing. The guests in the ballroom, who had been braced for a clumsy, perhaps comical performance, found themselves leaning in slightly. The judgment in their eyes began to soften, replaced by a quiet confusion. This was not what they had expected. Then the music began to change. The simple melody grew more complex, more confident. New voices joined in, harmonies that were rich and full of a deep, aching beauty. Ilara's fingers, which had been trembling, now moved with a certainty that was breathtaking to watch. They flew across the keys, no longer just pressing notes but sculpting them, shaping them into something alive. The music was no longer just sad. It was a story. It was the story of a life filled with hardship, but it was also a story of a spirit that refused to be broken. It was the sound of scrubbing floors and dreaming of constellations. It was the sound of a heart that had been bruised but had never stopped beating. The room was completely captivated. The man in the red tie, who had been smirking with anticipation, stood with his mouth slightly open, his forgotten champagne glass held loosely in his hand. The woman who had been clutching her pearls now let her hand fall to her side, her eyes wide with a dawning understanding. They were no longer seeing a servant girl who had made a mistake. They were seeing an artist, and the art she was creating was so raw, so honest, so undeniably real, that it was stripping away all the pretense and polish of their world. Even Mr. Ashworth was caught in the spell. The anger on his face had been replaced by a look of profound bewilderment. He stared at the girl at his piano, the girl he had been about to throw out onto the street, and he did not recognize her. The music she was playing was a language he did not speak, a world he did not know. It was powerful and unsettling, and it was happening in his house, on his piano, and for the first time in a long time. He felt completely out of control. But the person who was most changed was Isabel. She stood rooted to the spot, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. She was not just hearing the music, she was feeling it. It was as if Ilara had reached into her own chest and pulled out all the feelings she had never been able to name: the boredom, the loneliness, the desperate, silent scream for a life that meant something. The music was Ilara's truth, but it was also hers. It was the truth of every person who had ever felt trapped, who had ever had a song in their heart that no one else could hear. She watched the girl's fingers dance, and she felt a sense of pride so fierce it almost knocked her over. She had done this. She had not just saved the girl from punishment. She had set her free. And in setting her free, she felt a piece of herself break free. 2. The music swelled, rising to a crescendo that was not loud but was impossibly full. It was a wave of emotion that washed over everyone in the room, a sound of both heartbreak and hope, of loss and resilience. It was the sound of a soul laid bare. And then, as the final chord hung in the air, shimmering and perfect, Ilara's hands came to rest on the keys, and the music faded into silence. This time, the silence was different. It was not awkward or judgmental. It was not heavy or suffocating. It was a sacred, reverent silence. It was the silence of 100 people who had just witnessed something miraculous, and who were afraid to breathe for fear of breaking the spell. No one moved. No one spoke. They just stood there in the echoing quiet, their eyes fixed on the slight figure of the servant girl at the grand piano, a girl who had, in the space of a few minutes, changed everything. The final chord of Ilara's music seemed to hang in the air of the ballroom like a star, shimmering and pure. For a long moment, no one moved. The silence was no longer a weapon or a judgment. It was a shared, sacred space. It was the sound of 100 people realizing they had just been a part of something they would never forget. Then, a single sound broke the spell. It was the sound of 2 hands clapping together, slow and deliberate. It was the man in the red tie. His smirk was gone, replaced by an expression of genuine, stunned admiration. Another person joined in, then another, and soon a wave of applause filled the room. It was not the polite, obligatory clapping of a society event, but a deep, rolling thunder of appreciation. It was for the girl on the bench. Ilara flinched at the sound, her shoulders hunching as if she expected it to be a prelude to a punishment. She looked out at the sea of faces, and what she saw was not anger, but awe. A woman in the front row was dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. The stern-faced man who owned half the shipping fleet was nodding slowly, a look of profound respect on his face. They were not seeing a servant who had overstepped her bounds. They were seeing the musician who had just poured out her soul for them. But the applause also marked the end of the magic. The spell was broken, and the world, with all its rules and consequences, came rushing back in. The guests began to leave, but not as they had arrived. There was no more loud, empty chatter. They moved towards the door in small groups, their voices low and intense. The story of the servant girl and the piano was already being retold, each person adding their own layer of wonder. It was the most exciting thing that had happened at one of these parties in years. As they said their goodbyes to the host and hostess, their glances kept darting towards the ballroom, where Alara still sat. Small and lost, Mr. and Mrs. Ashworth were trapped, forced to smile and nod as their guests whispered about the miraculous performance and the incredible discovery. Their smiles were tight, their faces frozen in polite masks that barely concealed their fury. When the last car had crunched down the gravel driveway, and the front door was finally closed, the silence that fell over the house was heavy and cold. The staff, who had been watching from the shadows, scattered, suddenly finding urgent work to do in distant parts of the house. They knew a storm was about to break. Mr. Ashworth did not disappoint. He turned from the door, his face a mottled, dangerous red. He didn't look at Alara. He looked at his daughter. "What?" he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Was that?" Isabel stood her ground. She had felt a surge of something powerful and new during the applause. It was the feeling of having done the right thing, not just for Alara, but for herself. She was no longer a ghost. "It was music, Father," she said, her voice steady. "Don't be smart with me," he snarled, taking a step towards her. "You made a mockery of this family. You turned a respectable evening into a circus sideshow, allowing a servant to perform like some kind of street entertainer." "She wasn't entertaining," Isabel shot back, her own voice rising. "She was sharing something beautiful. Something you were too busy being important to notice." Mrs. Ashworth stepped between them, her hands held up as if to ward off a physical blow. "Please, please, let's not be hasty. The damage is done. What matters now is how we handle it." She looked at Alara, who was still frozen on the piano bench, her hands trembling in her lap. "The girl will have to be dismissed, of course. Immediately. We will pay her a generous severance, on the condition that she never speaks of this night to anyone." Lara's heart plummeted. Dismissed. It was the word she had been dreading. It meant being thrown back out into the world, alone and jobless. The brief, glorious moment of freedom was over, and the reality of her life was crashing back down. She lowered her head, waiting for the final word. No. The single word from Isabel was so quiet, yet it stopped everyone in their tracks. Her parents stared at her as if she had started speaking in tongues. "No," her father repeated, his voice dangerously low. "You do not get to say no in this house. I am the master here, and I say she goes." "You are the master of the house," Isabel said, her voice growing stronger with every word. "But you are not the master of music. You own this piano, Father. You own the house, the paintings, the silver. But you don't own that. What she did? You can't buy that. You can't order it. You can't dismiss it." She took a deep breath, knowing she was about to cross a line she could never uncross. You saw their faces, the guests. For the first time tonight, they weren't bored. They weren't just being polite. They were moved. They were impressed. Not with us, with our money or our parties. They were impressed with her. Her father scoffed. "Impressed with a servant? Don't be a fool." "Not being a fool," Isabel insisted, her eyes blazing with a passion he had never seen in her before. "I'm being practical. Think about it. Everyone is going to be talking about this tomorrow. Did you hear about the Ashworth's maid? The one who plays like an angel? It makes us look good. It makes us look like patrons of the arts, like people who discover talent. We don't hide her, Father. We We cultivate her. Mrs. Ashworth looked at her daughter, a flicker of something new in her eyes. It was the look of a strategist. Cultivate her. What on earth do you mean? Isabel turned her gaze to Ilara, who was now watching her with a mixture of terror and disbelief. She has a gift, a real one. It would be a crime to let her go back to scrubbing floors. She could be my music tutor. The suggestion hung in the air, so outrageous it was almost brilliant. A servant as a tutor for the daughter of the house? It was unheard of. It broke every rule of their rigid social structure. But it also offered a solution. It kept Ilara's talent in the family. It gave Isabel a new, interesting purpose. And it turned a scandal into a story. Mr. Ashworth was speechless. He paced the length of the ballroom, his mind racing. He was a man who understood value, and what his daughter was proposing was a unique kind of asset. It was risky, it was strange, but it was also intriguing. He looked at the piano, then at the girl, then at his daughter's determined face. He was trapped between his pride and his ambition. Fine, he finally bit out, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. The girl stays. But she will not be a tutor. She will be the keeper of the piano. Her duties will include its maintenance and providing music for the family. When asked, she will answer to you, Isabel. And if there is one more incident like tonight, if she steps one toe out of line, she is gone. Do you understand? Isabel nodded, a wave of relief so powerful it almost made her knees buckle. I understand. In the weeks that followed, a new and delicate harmony settled over the house. Ilara was no longer a housemaid, but she was not a guest either. She existed in a strange new space in between. She was given a small, simple room of her own, instead of a bed in the servants' quarters. Her hands, which had been roughened by years of scrubbing, began to soften. They were now dedicated to the ivory keys of the Steinway. The other servants treated her with a mixture of awe and jealousy, but they kept their distance. She was the master's daughter's project. The final scene takes place on a quiet afternoon, months later. The sun streams through the tall windows of the ballroom, just as it always had, but the room is no longer silent. It is filled with music. Ilara is at the piano, her fingers moving with a confidence and joy that had been buried for years. She is not playing a thunderous, emotional piece, but a simple, clear melody. Sitting next to her on the bench is Isabel. She is trying to play along, her fingers fumbling on the keys, a look of intense concentration on her face. Ilara gently corrects her hand position, her touch patient and kind. They are not friends. Not in the way the world understands friendship. There is still a space between them, a space defined by their different lives. But in that moment, by the piano, they are equals. They are two young women, connected by a shared love of music. A love that had broken through the silence of a gilded cage and changed everything. The room is quiet, but it is not the heavy, empty quiet of before. It is the quiet of collaboration, of learning, of a masterpiece in the making. It is the sound of a new reality, born from one girl's courage and one forbidden touch.